This episode offers psychosocial education designed to inspire and motivate our listeners. The information provided does not constitute a therapeutic relationship nor a substitute for professional mental health care. If you are experiencing a mental health crisis, call 911, go to your nearest emergency room, or for listeners in the United States, text 988 for the National Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. Warning, this episode contains brain food that will lead to improved emotional and social intelligence. Thanks for tuning in to Harvesting Happiness today for a healthy serving of consciously prepared brain food. This is Lisa Cypers Kamen, your host. Since 2010, we've been broadcasting sound ideas for better well-being. Each week, we spotlight diverse thinkers and doers who are contemporary trendsetters and change agents, devoting their lives to creating a better world. I invite you to listen and change how you think about human happiness. Our award-winning content is fresh, optimistic, and purpose-driven media that promotes well-being from the inside out. This episode is part of the Good Citizens Election Season Survival Guide to Restoring Common Sense and Sanity in a Crazy World, produced in collaboration with renowned, fair-minded subject matter experts who provide strategies that enhance critical thinking, increase civic engagement, and foster healthy pleasure to boost personal well-being and relationship satisfaction. You can also discover more unique bonus content at More Mental Fitness by Harvesting Happiness on Substack and Medium. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. Thanks for joining me on today's show, where we are continuing our conversation about civic engagement, empowered citizens shaping a better government. My guest today is a friend of the show, and I'm happy to welcome him back, and that is Dan Jasper. Dan Jasper founded Street Civics, a practical resource for citizen advocates after noticing an information gap in civic education. Dan has worked at local, state, national, and international levels for decades and has nonprofit experience working with organizations focused on issues such as international affairs, sustainable development, social justice, climate change, and peace building. And I must say now more than ever, peace building needs to be a focus of many Americans in a post-election world. Dan, welcome back.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited for our conversation, and a really big fan of what you're doing with Harvesting Happiness here. So I'm really excited for our conversation.
I also wanted to add that not only are you the founder of Street Civics, but you are a senior policy advisor for Project Drawdown. You have nearly 2 decades in government affairs and international relations. He has tackled issues from U.S.-North Korea relations to climate mitigation. He holds a master's in public policy from Duke and a bachelor's in cultural studies, global studies, and linguistics from the University of Minnesota. Dan, let's just jump right in here, because you and I were talking before we started the interview about civics and how it was at one time taught as a subject in school. I had that. You were probably at the tail end of that. And here we are decades later, kind of looking around like, what are we supposed to do?
Yeah. I mean, this is such an important point, right? And it's such a critical element missing from our education at this point. I think when I took it, and I'm not sure when you took it, I remember civics being really interesting to me, but not interesting to other folks, right? And that was one of the problems. But oftentimes, I think even the education system, what they supplied us with was more of a sort of descriptive analysis of how government functions on a very basic level, and not necessarily a prescriptive way of how to get involved. Right. And so there was that engagement element was always kind of missing from the education piece. But now we're missing even that sort of descriptive element of how government functions. And so now we kind of have to back up a little bit, right? When people want to get involved, we do have to sort of start from square one and look at the institutions that they can get involved with and build up their skills from there. So, I do wonder if it was part of a sort of systematic effort, right, to try to remove civic engagement, to be quite frank, and to
dumb
try
us down. Well, let's just be blunt.
Yeah, I think we can just be blunt. Yeah. To basically control populations to some degree. And I'm not sure where that decision really sat, to be honest, but we're paying the price for it nowadays.
I think that we forget that people who work in government, they work for us. Like we tend to view the power structure in reverse, right? That they're the more powerful ones. They're going to tell us policy and what to do. And we forget that we're the employers.
That's right. Yeah. It's such an important point, right? And oftentimes when I train people, when they go to speak to policymakers, that's the first thing I tell them, right? Don't be nervous and don't be worried that, what that person is going to judge about you because you're their boss.
Yes.
It's
Yes.
your call. But again, here we have that sort of, I don't know if it's necessarily systematic, but it is, in the US at least, a function of how our system is set up. And people have been so entrenched in their seats that I think it's easy for them to forget that they are accountable to the people. And instead, really, I think I see this in policymakers. You can almost see it in their eyes sometimes. They feel more responsible to special interest groups, the ones who are financing their campaigns, rather than the people who are voting for them. The campaign comes up every 4 years. Then you toss a bone to the people. But after that, they kind of have this sense of entitlement. And so it's a problem on both ends, is what I'm getting at, right? There's this mentality within the institutions and people who serve those institutions that they are above it and that they are occupy specific areas and positions of power. And the people are, unfortunately, I think that sentiment is prevalent amongst the general population as well.
I think it's important to note that it is not one side or the other, that this is pervasive no matter what political party we're talking about. So we want to make sure we're really clear about that it's not preferential.
100%. Yeah, it is. It is definitely. And in fact, I would even maybe take it a step further and say some of the divisiveness we're seeing is part of that, right? Is part of disempowering us.
Right.
And the old saying, divide and conquer. And that really has played out in historical cases. If you look sort of how empires function, even going back thousands of years, you see these sort of waves, almost these moments where golden hours and these golden ages of empires. And then there's these moments where there's huge divisiveness. And that has to do often with economics and how the political system is shaped by those who have money, to be quite frank. And so it's not unusual what we're seeing.
No, in fact, it rhymes, right? It's not necessarily history repeating itself, but it's definitely rhyming with,
exactly.
with tropes of the past. Let's talk a little bit about the election cycle and its duration and how, in my own mind, I think about how wearisome it is, right? That we get fatigue. It's almost like a form of battle fatigue, media fatigue, interest fatigue. And with that, while we lose interest, we also lose the power or the zest to want to change.
Yeah.
Want it just over, like, let it be over already.
Yeah, that is such a good point. And I think we're hearing a lot about this conversation right now where people are comparing the American political system with what we see in, say, Europe, where they run much shorter campaigns, sometimes within 100 days, right? And to them, they can turn over a government much quicker than we can. And obviously, their system is set up differently. But it does have huge impacts, right? And I think you're right. It certainly wears people down. It gets people less engaged. It also gives more and more chance for those special interests to have more power over them, because the longer a campaign is, the more money you're going to need to run it. So if you shorten that, then suddenly they're less reliant on that campaign financing, right? And there's all sorts of tweaks that you can do to campaigns that would improve that. Certainly there are some good sides to it. And part of that is, I think some of this was designed prior to social media.
Wait, let me just clarify. Good sides to the shorter campaign cycle or to the longer?
Just to the longer.
Okay.
To the longer, yeah. There's pros and cons to both. But into the long, there's the side where, well, it gives us more time to assess the candidates, right? And more time to assess a down ballot assessment. So there's some degree of merit in it, but in the world of a 24-hour news cycle where, we're just bombarded with news every day, it's probably no longer necessary, right? And that was really meant for a time before the internet.
that makes perfect sense, right? It took a long time for news to travel, so you wanted to give people enough time to digest. Candidates were more apt to engage in debate and discourse between themselves than they are now. Right now, you sort of have debate dodging going on.
Mhm.
And I want to talk a little bit about the down ballot assessment, because I think that's another thing that what has happened in the climate around us is now everybody's operating in fear. They're no longer assessing the candidates down ballot for who they are, but like, okay, I've got to vote the entire party line because I'm scared.
Hmm. Well, that's a really good, interesting point because they're scared of what the other side is going to do. And so,
Yes,
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 they're
on both
thinking black and
sides.
white. Yeah. Yeah. The black and white thinking, I think, is definitely more prevalent today. There's no question about that. The down ballot measures, yeah. I mean, they clearly are. And if I could just use, Joe Biden here, I think is a pretty important example because this is it's a historical data point, right? So no
Yeah,
matter what side you're on, let's just look at it through academic eyes. And what you see is when people thought he was going to have the nomination, everybody below him was polling a lot worse. And that's kind of a tried and true sort of known when it comes to politics, or you can't really poll above your highest candidate. And so even when they were doing test runs on Kamala Harris, how she would fare against Trump, she was doing worse than she is now after Biden dropped out, because now that top level person is out. And so now,
right.
you can go higher. So it has huge impacts on not just who you're going to vote for, but voter turnout and enthusiasm for those candidates. Because if you think, well, I'm really enthused about this local candidate, but up top, I'm not really sure that the party's being controlled by the right person, your expectations of that local candidate will be tempered quite readily, as opposed to if you get somebody at the top who has more aligned views with yours, then you're more prone to think those local candidates have more power, right? And you're more prone to get excited about them.
Let's talk a little bit about local candidates and the groundswell of interest in local politics and how much good stuff is actually happening on the local scenes around the country. I think that that's been kind of a silver lining of all of this.
That's very true. That's such a good point. Now, I'll admit, my current most recent experiences at the national and international level, it's been a while since I've been at the state level, but actually I started out there. I started out at the Minnesota House of Representatives, and it was incredibly exciting. It was one of the most exciting jobs I had because so much work gets done at the state level, as well as the city and even municipal level. And I think people do kind of forget that because they think about the national and they want to affect the big thing. But really, so much of the national is built on those building blocks of state policies and states testing out various laws and things. Nowadays, we're seeing a return to this. And here again, part of it is because there's been so much special interest money flowing into these local candidates. I mean, we're even seeing special interest money flowing into school boards and these elections that we used to think were kind of benign, but now are being injected with a certain degree of politicalization. So it's becoming incredibly important to pay attention to the local level, to get involved where you can. And I think to see it as, again, that foundation for national level changes that people want to see.
Let's take a break. And when we come back, we will continue the conversation with Dan Jasper. To learn more, please go to streetcivics.com. You can find him on LinkedIn at Daniel Jasper. Here comes that pause. We'll be right back. Harvesting happiness is rooted in science. Our work facilitates applied positive psychology practices through media and consulting. We're committed to sound ideas for better well-being, leading to increased life satisfaction and a better world for everyone. We're not into pseudoscience or quick fixes. We're focused on common sense backed by rigorous research. Healthy critical thinking is the foundation for our discussions. We encourage you to challenge preconceptions and explore ideas with a curiously discerning mind. Collaboration with our guests is united by an inclusive vision to boost resilience, critical thinking, communication, and problem solving through civilized discourse and pleasurable relational engagement for everyone. Each day, we have the intellectual freedom to be happy or the liberty to be miserable, regardless of external circumstances. If you or someone you know is struggling with mental health, please seek support because good psychological health is vital to the achievement of a healthy and satisfying life. Visit harvestinghappiness.com for psychosocial and educational services that boost emotional and social intelligence. And we're back, continuing the conversation with Dan Jasper, talking about civic engagement, empowered citizens shaping a better government. Let's get back to it. So, Dan, let's talk about ways in which we can expand our civic engagement beyond just registering and showing up to vote or putting the ballot in the mail.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a good question. I think people are kind of being a little tired of being told to vote, right? It sounds a little right. Let me try to give you a 30-second sort of crash course. And your podcast is doing a wonderful job of this, of making sure that we start to see self-care as probably our first order of business when it comes to civic engagement. There's so many layers to this. And I think that's, that might sound trite, but it's the absolute truth. And there's actually scientific analogies I can make. What, for example, I work on food systems quite a bit. And I heard a physician the other day say, well, if you're really worried about biodiversity, you first need to worry about your own body, because we are just a third of our cells are human cells. The rest are microbial life that are working with us to support our life, right? And so this is a huge biodiversity. Your own body is a sort of biodiversity hotspot. So you got to take care of yourself. And when you don't, one problem that we see quite often is people eating too much meat, which isn't healthy, and certain microbial life flourish within your own body that goes out in your waste system. And it actually messes with our waterways, so much so that Americans are getting so much protein, it's actually impacting fish life. And so this is such a beautiful case of how you're taking care of yourself has an immediate impact on your environment, right? And this goes for emotional cases, right, as well. The better we can tend to ourselves, the better we're interfacing with our community and building up better social cohesion, right?
I love what you just said, because I know that when we are in a state of stress and anxiety, right, we've got a lot of cortisol that is flowing through our body. And what cortisol, the stress hormone, does is it disconnects us from the thinking part of the brain, and we react impulsively, right? It brings out the cave person in us, and we do stupid things. And you can see this over and over and over again in the media. And this is a result of being at that high stress level constantly. There's no hierarchy.
Yeah, absolutely. That's such a good point. And on top of that, just to bring it a step further, I think regulating the nervous system is something that ancient traditions, religious and spiritual, physical, have talked about for thousands of years, and for good reason, right? Because exactly what you're saying. If you know how to regulate and to sort of take a deep breath, some people use the terminology like center yourself, however you want to think of it. It's so important because that's going to impact your actions down the line. So, starting with yourself, going towards, and then understanding that interpersonal relationships, how you treat your family, your community, is another part of that. And then it's how do we interact with our institutions? Yeah. So institutions are a tertiary goal here. And I think, the quote from, I think it was Leo Tolstoy, who said, everybody dreams about changing the world, but nobody thinks about changing themselves. And I think that it's such an important thing that I remind myself almost daily, because I'm not perfect and there's a lot of work I got to do. But doing that simultaneously is perhaps the only way that we're really going to have substantial, significant, long-lasting change, right? If we're managing ourselves, our community, and the institutions simultaneously.
And if we're living in fear, right? If we are in a fearful place ourselves, whether it's a fear of the other or the otherness of the other, or fear of not having enough of scarcity, for example, in that state of fear, we cannot do the good work. We're impulsively reacting to everything that is around us. So I think tending to those insecurities within ourselves and be aware that we're not projecting that onto others, with our finger pointing in groups who are not like us. I think that's a civic-minded act, actually.
Yes, 100%. Yes.
But it's hard to describe that to somebody, right? If they are looking to restore the country to a vision that's been held in the rearview mirror, right? But it's not dealing with the reality of who and what we are today. One can be angry, one can be upset, right? Because we're as a species, we don't like change.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that that's an important distinction, right? There's a difference between being angry and being fearful. Maybe they're related and they're kind of both on the sort of negative feeling spectrum, but in a fear-based place, you feel powerless, right? And it is something that can either provoke violence from somebody or perhaps despondency or depression. Anger is at least a little bit more empowered, and it becomes more about how we channel it and how we deal with that anger. I often tell people, especially when I deal with young people today, that it's okay to feel angry. Nobody
Yeah.
can police your feelings about this, but you just can't let it dictate your actions. And you have to sort of allow those feelings and just observe them and allow them to take their course and pass, which again is it's a mindfulness technique, and it's so important when it comes to civic engagement. So here again, we have this dovetailing of mindfulness, of philosophy, spirituality, whatever you want to call it, and our civic engagement duties. And I think that's one thing that we've really lost as a society, that the connection between those two
Yes.
things.
I agree with you. And I have two young adult children, and they are not particularly politically active. However, they know, they're very aware of their civic responsibility and duty. They're like, I don't want to live my life in the 24/7 news cycle. I don't really watch it. I'm kind of aware of what's going on. I know what I need to do because I'm aware of the kind of world that I want to live in, but I'm not going to find myself twisted up if the outcome is not the way that I hope it will be. And I thought that's pretty mature, because for many of us, we're going to be pretty devastated if the change that we're hoping for doesn't happen.
Yeah, yeah, that's a beautiful approach, I think, and it's almost I don't want to say detached, but it's certainly more of an observant role, right?
Yes.
Rather than, and I often tell people that when you see protests or you see political events happen in the media, try your best to not judge it immediately and say this is good, this is bad, and I hate this, I love this, and say this is happening, and try to understand it as a data point. What does that data point tell you about grievances that may exist within society, how information is flowing, that kind of stuff? Because when you can tap into the fundamental reasons what's driving human behavior, you can get a sense of what really needs to be done to change society.
Yeah.
Because the history is full of examples of movements that have explicit demands, but actually they're grievances about something completely different. And they've been a little bit manipulated into terms of who's to blame or what's to blame for their situation.
Well, it's kind of like when we're in a relationship, we have a partner and we do that kitchen sink arguing thing, right? That we're not just necessarily arguing about that one issue that sets us off. It's everything else that's been swept under the rug comes along for the fight. And I
It's
feel
a
like there's a
perfect
lot
example.
of that happening.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. So in your children's approach of understanding how mechanically they should engage and maintaining that responsibility while maintaining a sense of sort of non-judgment about it all, which I think is just amazing, is something that I wish we could see more of, to be quite honest. And
It's
I think,
unique. I think
yes,
it's
it
very
is.
interesting. And
It is.
apparently, it's a lot of their peers feel the same way. Now, I will say that they are young adults living on a coast, right? They're living in a more liberal area. And I think maybe that is a something that they're surrounded by, that kind of operating system. If you were to
Yeah.
go to the middle of the country, it might be very different.
That's another good point. I grew up a little north of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in a very small farm town. And when I go back home, everybody knows me as the guy who made it to DC, right? And so everybody wants to tell me their political opinions. And what I often find is, I guess I noticed very quickly that almost nobody wanted to hear my opinions. They wanted to tell me theirs. And that's because they don't have any modes or channels to engage with. And at the end of the conversations, no matter how tense they got, almost always my old high school friends would say, well, it was good to talk to somebody about this because I don't have anybody to talk to. And in some ways, when we see urban centers, it is a lot easier to get engaged. It's a lot easier to know how to get engaged with the city level government versus a small town who may have just, a few people managing the mayor's office, basically. That can be frustrating. And so understanding what are your real pathways. And if you do live in urban areas, then maybe you want to go step up and maybe you want to go to the state level and see what kind of engagement you can do there, because at the local level may be just too small to do much. But I also wouldn't discount it either, and make sure that you're first engaging with that, first looking at it, deconstructing it, seeing if you can make change. And if you can't, then maybe go level up, if that makes sense.
And we all can go a level up. I mean, the point is that we all have access to these people who work for us. We don't think necessarily that we do, but we do. And it's the obligation of these individual offices to respond to a citizen's inquiry.
Yes.
They have to respond. They will respond.
Yes, they will respond. And I think, the difference, though, is sort of, how do you really make a change? Because I think when it comes down to voter engagement, and just to get into the details a little bit, people think voting, they think maybe writing their member of Congress. And oftentimes when I start training people on advocacy techniques, the questions I get are typically, does writing your congressperson work? Do protests work? Do petitions work? And I kind of chuckle to myself, because it must be like asking a carpenter, do hammers, screwdrivers really work? And the answer to them must be, well, of course, there's a reason they've been around for thousands of years, but you still need to know when and how to use them.
Yeah.
And in the same way that we can't drive a single nail into a piece of wood and expect it to build a house, we can't send a single letter to a member of Congress and expect it to change everything. There needs to be a sort of long-term arch and plan and methodical approach to how you go about it that can really have the best impact, especially nowadays, right? With so many people weighing in.
Tips, please?
With tips, yes. So, the first tip is, it's all about escalation. So you want to start at this lowest possible, low risk, lowest visibility thing you can possibly do, which is usually a meeting. So you try to get a meeting with them first. Okay, if you can't get a meeting, then maybe you go to a letter. And when you go to a letter, there's multiple types of letters that you can do, but you try to get mileage out of it, right? You don't just write it to your member of Congress. Maybe you also send it to your local newspaper. Maybe you also team up with a bunch of people in your area and you send the same letter and you alert the news. You send a press release, right? And then when that doesn't work, then maybe you write the administration agency that would be in charge of your issue, right? So really, as somebody who's been an intern in a lot of these institutions, what you're trying to do is get your issue logged as many times as possible. So you want to get it as many interns as you can to read it. And then you want to get as much visibility, and you slowly build up. And if you get nowhere with the letter writing, maybe then it's time to organize a protest. Same time, you start to think about, how can you use that protest to get more mileage out of it? Can you get the press involved? Can you get other, perhaps what they call them, validators, maybe former members of Congress or officials that can come speak to that issue, people who have credibility. So that's just a very quick example of what an arc might look like. And
that's a lot. Those are really good tips. And maybe even public figures that might even be, I'm going to sneeze. Oh, excuse me. Actors or actresses, I know it's kind of weak, but if you have somebody who has a public face or a big following to help amplify the message, that is also helpful, I would imagine.
100%. Yeah, it's not weak at all. I mean, the example that comes to my mind is Tarania Burke in the Me Too movement, right? Remember, she tweeted that for almost a decade, right? That hashtag, and nobody paid attention until Melissa Milano retweeted it one day. And then boom, the world's on fire, right? And so the longevity, making sure you have a long arc to your engagement, think in terms of years, not in terms of days or minutes, but think in terms of years. And yes, external validators, think about how you can get them involved, because they can be just a huge boom to your movement. Yeah.
Let's just say a word or two or three or 10 about protests and defaming property and violence, because in my view, that's not the way to go. But you may have some other words of wisdom.
Yeah, well, I mean, I agree with you. Violence, and to clarify, protests and violence are two different things, right?
Yes.
And, they can also often bleed into each other. What's really interesting is the term violence and what different cultures consider violent. That's probably the basic starting point. In the United States, most people consider acts against property also violent, not just against humans and animals and such, but property as well. Other countries, they don't consider acts against property violent. So that's a little bit of a cultural specific thing. But when it does come to no matter what you consider violence, we know through very, very detailed analysis and data work through two researchers, Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan, who looked in detail at nonviolent movements. And in fact, Erica Chenoweth is very vocal about the fact that she was very skeptical about nonviolent movements. And what the research found was that nonviolent movements were by far and away the most impactful. And in fact, violent movements actually had the worst ability to affect change, because what would happen is you get stuck into guerrilla warfare, civil war, and over time, the resistance movement becomes more and more militarized. And by the time they take power, they're basically the same thing as they tried to kick out. They're another dictatorship with a new person at the helm.
Makes
so
total
nonviolent
sense.
movements are by far and away the best way to change society for the long haul.
Love that. I think that's super important, and that change is possible, and that it requires perseverance, it requires patience, it requires a stick-to-itiveness, delayed gratification, which is something that we as Americans, as I think is unique to American society, the desire to have, our instant gratification. We want something, it comes to us, and we scratch the itch immediately. Whereas other countries, they're used to this. They're used to change coming slowly.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I mean, advocacy, I think, is such an exercise in trying to relax the ego in a way, because it's not even just on those elements. There's the other element of the more you move an issue, the less you'll be able to take credit for it. If you really want to move an issue, because basically, it might be your idea, but once a member of Congress starts to champion it, you basically have to let them run with it, because they're the ones with the microphone, right? And so there has to be a letting go of that. And so it is a constant exercise in trying to understand, really, what are you trying to achieve? Is it to pump yourself up, or is it to actually make change, substantial change? And it's a hard thing for everybody to go through. You want credit for the change you make, but sometimes you have to let it go.
Well, and there are some philosophical teachings that say that being anonymous, affecting change anonymously is even more powerful. Because the person who is affecting the change knows they've done it, and that could be enough, just knowing that the change is happening.
Yeah. And is it enough? Is something that you really need to ask yourself as you go through the process, right? I'll say, I think in most cases, somebody's going to know it was you, right? Somebody's going to know. And so you can take comfort in the fact that somebody knew that it was your idea, if that's really important to you. But at the end of the day, you really do need to think about what's really important here, taking credit or getting the job done.
I'd say getting the job done. We are out of time, and I would love for our listeners to continue the conversation on our special edition of More Mental Fitness, which is part of Harvesting Happiness. To learn more about the work of Dan Jasper, please go to streetcivics.com. You can find him on LinkedIn as Daniel Jasper. I think you and I are going to have to keep talking, because it feels for me very hopeful. And I hope that it inspires this in our listeners to do something.
Yeah. No, thank you so much for this platform. I mean, it is so important. And I hope it is empowering and people have a sense of agency here. I think that more and more I'm finding my job is not to impact institutions. It's to remind people of their own power.
Yeah. Love that. Thanks for joining us on Harvesting Happiness today. This is Lisa Cypers Kamen on behalf of my guest, Dan Jasper, wishing you kind thoughts, kinder words, and the kindest of actions. Until next time, remember, happiness is an inside job. Happiness is your inside job. Please go out and rock your day, and remember to be kind to one another. Want to explore more sound ideas for better well-being? You can listen to part 2 of this conversation and the Good Citizens Election Season Survival Guide to Restoring Common Sense and Sanity in a Crazy World at More Mental Fitness by Harvesting Happiness on Substack and Medium. Subscribe, listen, and share hundreds of downloadable episodes wherever you get your podcasts. Connect with and follow us on most social media channels. To learn more about lifestyle management and mental fitness consulting services, please visit harvestinghappiness.com. Harvesting Happiness and More Mental Fitness are produced by Lisa Cypers Kamen, Andrea Mengele, Robin Boyd, Andrea Daly, and the excellent team at Podfly Productions, including Eric Begay, Kimberly Beck, and Alec Guess, in collaboration with TogiNet Radio, KBUU, RadioMalibu.net, and is available on PRX, the Public Radio Exchange.